One of my Christmas traditions as a child, which exasperated my better adjusted parents, was to stake out a place in front of the telly in the weeks leading up to Christmas like a modern day console warrior, waiting the release of the next incarnation of the Sony WoW box or whatever. The programs didn't interest me, but as soon as the program ended, I was there, staring intently at the screen, hoping to God himself to catch the first glimpse of that year's Christmas look. The wait could occasionally be frustrating, especially as sometimes I would start this ritual as early as mid-November, but it was all worth it for that 90th minute goal sensation when you realised this is it. This is the Christmas trailer. It's happening. This is Christmas.
And it wouldn't be Christmas without you. Care for me, I know it's true. Merry Christmas, Merry la la la. And it wouldn't be Christmas without you. Care for me, I know it's true. Merry Christmas, Merry la la la.
These days the Christmas looks are unveiled unconscionably early, generally around the second week of December, and they stick around until New Year's Day. The latter I don't have a problem with. The rest of the country's still celebrating, why shouldn't the telly? They should get the same splash of cold water in the face as we do on January the 2nd. But in the former case, Christmas idents only used to appear on December the 24th. That was the second half of my Christmas ritual. Having built up the anticipation with the lavish trailer packages across the previous 3 weeks, now I get to see what the actual ident looks like on Christmas Eve. These days you don't really have trailer packages, they just show you the programme and then give you a bluntly utilitarian animation and final slide. Back in the day, however, they used to spend time on these things, and money, which I suspect is more to the point when considering why they don't do it anymore. But I don't want to come across like some kind of aged colonel sitting by a fireplace complaining that everything's rubbish now, especially since I'm only 30. Everything we see now is going to be nostalgia for someone in 20 years or so. They just seem to be getting less to be nostalgic about than we did. While the ITV regions, and when it came along Channel 4, would participate in this sort of thing as well, there's something about the whole notion of Christmas presentation that just screams BBC. And it's them that they're mostly associated with. But these things took a lot of hard work for something that would only be seen for a little over a week at best, especially in the old days of motorised clockwork spheroids and the like, which were generally only unveiled right before Nationwide on Christmas Eve and put straight to bed before Boxing Day. That's the whole point of this kind of ephemeral nostalgia. People worked on this, spent time putting it together to make it the very best it could be, to make people happy, with the certain knowledge that it would all be forgotten about. They could have just stuck a bit of snow on their logo and no one would have thought any less of them. But that wasn't going to fly. This is Christmas. It has to be special. And that's why these things deserve to be remembered. So please commit everything you're about to see to your long-term memories in a little folder marked permanent storage. This is a journey through Christmas with the BBC. Okay, we start in 1974 for the simple reason that that's the earliest one we have any extant footage of. At this point, BBC One was still using the original incarnation of the Mirror Globe, as seen several times on Monty Python's Flying Circus. And it was a deceptively simple notion to replace the usual painted-on continents and oceans with an actual spinning globe model, with instead of the usual reflection behind it, some holographic snowflake-looking tinsel. BBC Two's regular ident at the time was just a colossal numeral 2, which, like many of these, was much more complicated than it needed to be. The Christmas ident that year, though, actually reused the model from the previous ident, on a sort of victory lap, complete with laurel wreaths made of tinsel. They also thoughtfully provided a caption showing the day, just in case you were that drunk. And to be honest, in 1974 you probably were, if only because it was the only way you could keep warm. By 1975, BBC One's Mirror Globe had had a revamp, gaining a much easier on the eyes colour scheme of blue and gold, and a much easier on the eyes typeface of Futura Bold, very much the classiest of typefaces. The Christmas ident, however, was much of a muchness. Now this was more forgivable then than it is now. Physical models like this were pretty expensive to make and maintain, no point throwing out a perfectly good one, so they reused the actual mechanical model, but with some slightly different lighting effects and a different caption. As for BBC Two that year, well, they could have had Father Christmas tucking into a venison burger for all I know, because no footage exists that I'm aware of. 1976 saw the first appearance of a real mainstay of the season on BBC One, the snowflake. They're round, they're often seen revolving, it's a no-brainer. BBC Two, meanwhile, saw a then rare adaptation of the usual ident, with the enormous numeral going all glam rock, only 3 years after its peak, with an effect that looked a bit like one of those rubbish hologram things you used to get in packets of cereal and the like that didn't do anything. 1977 gave the world the first big star of these things. The pudding. Christmas cultural touchstone for those of a certain age. And the first time they'd actually used the mirror thing properly in a Christmas ident. BBC Two's one was more abstract. A big red 2 rotating around what turned out to be an emerald once colour footage was finally rediscovered a few years ago. The BBC went a bit weird at Christmas 1978. BBC One's look that year was the nightmarishly rotating severed head of Father Christmas, who turned out to have a second leering face behind his usual face. Or possibly in front of it. Once again, moving footage of the BBC Two look for this year eludes us, at least of the ident, but we do have this silent footage of the trailer package that year, revealing some sort of medieval theme. Not that the Middle Ages were particularly Christmassy, but there you go. That beheaded Santa beast might have been genuinely terrifying, but he did symbolise a break from the need to imitate the mirror globe with these things, as BBC One instead decided to embrace the rotating tableau, usually based on the Quality Street tin, as with these carol singers from 1979. BBC Two, meanwhile, had just introduced the first ever computer-generated ident into Britain, but everybody knows when it comes to Christmas, the old traditions are the best. Hence, another motorised rotating snowflake. Into the 80s, and BBC started the new decade the way they'd ended the old, with another Quality Street tin tableau. This being the year of Robin Cousins, everybody's ice skating. The idents are growing more and more lavish. Last year there was a wall, and some lights, and for the first time variant versions for day and night, implying that these poor sods have to spin around for hours and hours and hours on end. BBC Two, meanwhile, went with another snowflake. And why not? With some extra lighting effects and chunkety future lettering. In 1981, the BBC revamped the mirror globe one last time, changing the gold to an eye-searing lime green, and replacing the extremely cool Futura with a rather less than pleasant double-striped typeface. For Christmas, they dropped the notion of chocolate box tableau in favour of a swirling flock of baubles with the continents drawn on them. BBC Two, however, kept the faith with abstraction, with these genuinely hypnotic, rotating optical illusion candles, with a caption reading Christmas 2 like it's a sequel. 1982 saw a return to the snowflake motif, with this surprisingly elaborate prop featuring no less than 8 separate articulatable limbs, spinning independently of one another. Meanwhile, BBC Two gave us some pointy trees, a pointy, performing a shimmering waltz above an equally pointy BBC Two typeface, flanked by 2 more trees, just in case you were unaware that the theme for this year was trees. 1983 is my birth year and my first Christmas, as if you care, and that year BBC One gave us another snowflake. Slightly different this time around though, 6 branches instead of 8, but with added holographic effects. Personally though, I preferred the clock. BBC Two also went for a variation on the previous year. Instead of clear plastic, the trees are now made of holographic metal, which makes them even more hypnotic. The infant me was probably fascinated. Even now I could watch it for hours. Probably will too. (1983) is also the earliest we could dredge up any of the regional variants, specifically this faintly lysergic little number for BBC Scotland, which looks like what happens when Grampian Television drops acid. In 1984, Michael Grade became controller of BBC One, and he transformed the station. Among the major changes under his purview was the replacement of the mirror globe, after 15 years faithful service and 2 mechanical models, in favour of something a little more computer generated, as was the style at the time. Mechanical idents didn't go away immediately though, and that Christmas we were treated to 3 revolving snow persons, and I use the term with precision, because Michael Grade stipulated they be gender neutral, hence one of them having breasts. Fair enough. I'm far from transphobic after all. The idea of intergender snow people bothers me much less than contemplating this bizarre 3-way cracker that they appear to have just pulled. I mean, look at it. What the hell? What the hell, Michael Grade? What the hell? Oh well, they did go to the trouble of providing variants for daytime, evening and nighttime once again, so it's hard to be too cross at them for it. BBC Two, meanwhile, went with a stylised rendition of the holiday's name, revolving around a dangling pink bauble with the BBC Two stripy logo on it. It could be charitably described as inexpensive, but it's not without its charms, even if the rotating word does have a tendency to throw the turntable into sharp relief, and even if the complete lack of a backdrop makes it look like the bauble is dangling not off a tree, but instead some kind of bizarre existentialist wasteland. That's except for viewers in Scotland who had their own ident, which apparently depicted some psychedelic Toblerones rotating in front of a vast mirror. In 1985, the mirror globe was finally put away for good, to be replaced with one of the most famous incarnations of the globe, one which is still quietly impressive and authoritative even now, even if it was named after a farmyard animal. The computer-originated world had arrived, and graphics would never be the same again, except when they were, like that Christmas. You see, the thing about this is, making the cow was a massive undertaking. It took 3 whole departments of the BBC working together to get the damn thing done. It's not really surprising that by the end of the year they only had enough money and energy left to create some kind of Tesco value blue gem, 2 rather tatty stuffed robins from Woolworth, a turntable covered in Lux Flakes, and a moulded plastic version of the new BBC One typeface. All that said, however, I love the robins. I always did. I think they're endearingly rubbish. Many people agree with my assessment. Or half of it, anyway.
Thank you. Very happy New Year to you.
By the new year, the robins found themselves at the centre of the first of many tragedies to happen on the Late Late Breakfast Show, as Noel, clearly drunk with power, destroyed the innocent birds with a blunderbuss.
Would you like me to do it? Yes! 1, 2, 3.
Proof, if anyone needed, that Noel Edmonds is the most evil being to ever walk the earth. It was around this time, with the ascendancy of Michael Grade, that the BBC really started to figure out the concept of branding. The BBC's trailer packages really started to gain unified looks for the first time, and more importantly, feels. The stings and menus were updated on a seasonal basis, and grew more and more lavish as the decade wore on, each an attempt to reach into the viewer's individual hindbrain and evoke some kind of specific, very primal feeling and then associate it with BBC One or BBC Two. So trailers for summer seasons were all bright lights and sunbathing and movement and colours, while autumn ones were cosy and muted, but not to the extent of being either dull or depressing. And of course, this stretched to include Christmas. Now, we'd had Christmas trailer stings before, of course, and sometimes they even related to the resulting ident, but this is where it really started to get taken seriously. And so over Christmas in 1985 on BBC One, the robins were absolutely everywhere, although ultimately the Raymond Briggs-ish cell-animated ones they used for the trailers probably just made the stuffed ones even more disappointing when they showed up. But there you go. All this feverish mid-80s marketing speak hadn't really reached BBC Two yet, though. Their trailers were still relatively generic, having little or nothing to do with the final ident, which turned out to be another mechanical job, the last that BBC Two would ever use. It was also the last Christmas for this stripety too. The modern era was coming, whether they liked it or not. Motors and gears were still very much the order of the day over in Scotland as well. They gave us, effectively, a square world, as promised by Michael Bentine all those years ago. Which kind of breaks my brain to contemplate, really. I mean, what happens to that top half of Canada once the box is opened? This is the first Christmas ident I actually remember seeing on an actual television. It was apparently the result of a children's BBC competition, which ended in a three-way tie between the Star, the Treeman, and the Little Dancing Holly Squadron. Apparently all these characters had names. I remember my mother telling me what they were. I stress I remember my mother telling me what they were. I don't remember what she actually said. I was 3. Meanwhile, change has come upon BBC Two, as controller Graham MacDonald decides to chase the sophisticated crowd, and effectively transform it into what BBC 4 is today, i.e. an intellectual and art-conscious channel with some great programmes, only about 5% of which are ever likely to appeal to any given individual. There's room for that now. In 1986, not so much. As a kid, I always liked the TWO logo, because it was strange and mysterious and different, but I can't really claim it held any great actual appeal. Even now, my love for the logo is basically 99.9% nostalgia. It certainly wasn't a terribly good idea for a channel identity, being simultaneously cold and sterile and eerie and haunting, especially when it formed up in absolute stone-cold silence, and even more especially when it faded out before the announcer had finished speaking. Another thing it wasn't was terribly flexible for such as Christmas-related adaptation. There was something obvious that could be done with some bas-relief shapes on a white background, and sure enough, Christmas 1986 had the theme of snow. This was actually a groundbreaking ident in that it was the first Christmas ident to be fully electronically generated, which is nice. Meanwhile, in Scotland, as if to confirm every single stereotype of the Scots that exists, we got the cow with a bit of a night sky added to it. It did much better in Wales that year, with this proper greetings card image of a snowbound church, which also worked as a guilt-generating incentive in case you were thinking of skipping chapel that year. 1987 wasn't a great year, and I don't just mean because that was the year my sister was born. BBC One's Christmas ident had a great idea attached to it, but failed at the final hurdle. BBC Trailermeister Bernard Newnham, who was in charge of the Christmas look that year, was basically sick and tired of models, which were, to be fair, looking increasingly quaint. Instead, he took the previous year's example and went with cell animation. But that wasn't his big idea. His big idea was to link the idents in with the trailers themselves. So the trailers would end with a proper animated blast straight into the ident. Now that was a nice idea, so it was a shame about the ident itself. It just doesn't work. The design is far too busy, plus it seems to be for a channel named Christmas rather than a channel named BBC One, because both elements of the actual channel name are dumped in extremely unintuitive, seemingly random parts of the design, and the sludgy grey-brown background, which I can only assume is meant to be evocative of a fireplace, is ultimately almost as Christmassy as the 1879 Tay Bridge disaster. Finally, for all that Newnham wanted animation, the final product is actually less animated than the previous years, just a slightly flickering flame. Everything else is static. The frustrating thing is that the opening toy room from the trailers, with the animated ribbons and what have you, that's pretty good. That's evocative. They should have made more of that, rather than mixing to ugliness on brown. BBC Two fared little better. I assume it's supposed to look like a Christmas tree, although in the event it looks like the Alan Japes BBC Two logo with a green triangle on top of it, and a small red line in between. Frustratingly, it makes the same mistake as BBC One, by starting off with quite a nice idea, with the stylised trees and the snowball fighters all reflected in a bauble, and then panning to a rather crappy and not very Christmassy still picture. The Scots actually had the best ident with this stained glass confection, although there's a lot to be said for Northern Ireland's traditionalist rotating Christmas cake as well. Things picked up again in 1988. BBC One had an animated partridge, quite literally in a pear tree. I suppose it could have come up with a more intuitive way of placing the station name, but why be a ponce about it? What do you mean, too late? Usually the partridge flew in, then it closed down, which was a nice touch. Meanwhile, BBC Two's contribution sums up the year 1988 just about as well as anything possibly could.
Seasonal style on two.
BBC Two were now controlled by Alan Yentop, and were really pushing the whole line about, "We're an arts channel!" Hence idents like this one with its cool jazz and strange angles and avant-garde design, and it's absolutely lovely, and you wouldn't see anything like this in this day and age at all, if only because it's not 1988 anymore. The Scots went with this adorable bit of stop motion, while the BBC Wales presentation department apparently forgot about the whole thing until Christmas Eve, at which time they went down to Cardiff Woolworths in a bloody hurry. 1989 brought one of my favourites, my generation's revolving Christmas pudding, which isn't a sentence you'll hear very often. Technically, this globe spinning top is an old-fashioned mechanical ident, like the mirror globe, and the last that the National BBC One ever used. But the lighting and the set dressing make it more like stop-motion animation than the relatively Spartan tableau of old. Compare it with that year's effort from BBC Scotland, for example. The Welsh, for their part, stuck with the spinning top motif, but went with a computer-generated one instead, which they were apparently incredibly proud of, because the ident lasted forever. Well, 30 seconds, which is a bloody long time when you're just staring at an endlessly spinning top, waiting for it to introduce Rockcliffe's folly. This was the year that the trailer package really came into its own as well. Bernard Newnham was still the man at the controls, and this time he delivered an extraordinarily luxurious, and to the 6-year-old me, unbearably exciting stop-motion animation of what looked like some sort of Edwardian Toy Story. BBC Two, meanwhile, had been steadily losing its tiny mind since Alan Yentop took over, becoming increasingly oblique and confrontational in the name of quite brilliant art. Hence the 1989 Christmas ident being set in some kind of confusing beige wilderness that looks like Samuel Beckett took ecstasy and fell asleep to deliberately atonal, percussive synth. Christmas was usually the only time in this particular BBC Two era that the ident had any sound whatsoever. In 1989, the viewer may have been questioning whether or not this was an advantage. 1990 would prove to be the last rodeo for this sort of creative freedom at Christmas, as corporate branding was almost literally around the corner. Just 8 weeks into 1991, the cow was put out to pasture for good, Which is just as well, because if I catch myself making any more cow-related puns, I will have to punch myself in the throat. And so, for the last Christmas, where presentation would have absolute artistic freedom, Bernard Newnham unveiled his masterpiece.
Christmas on BBC One.
This genuinely magical and deceptively simple-looking piece of stop motion took 3 departments, dozens of people, and the very latest Quantel technology to pull off. And they even included the actual cow graphics themselves for the first and only time in a Christmas ident. In fact, if you don't count the balloon on which the globe appeared by default, this would be the last time they bother integrating the thing into the Christmas ident at all, to date. BBC Two, meanwhile, were being as arty and inscrutable as ever, albeit using actual Christmas-related iconography this time around. At least in the trailers. Quite what's going on in the ident is anybody's guess. Like many other recent entries, this one would occasionally go straight to the ident out of the trailer. A side effect of this was that the music for the ident itself consisted solely of 2 notes, the last of which tended to be held perpetually until the announcer had finished speaking, by which point it tended to sound like a siren heralding the apocalypse. Like the globe, the TWO was on its way out. Under Yentop, BBC Two had been competing for the highbrow and or alternative sort of the market, but unlike Channel 4, they were hamstrung by their image being, with the best will in the world, dull. Channel 4 had blocks flowing through space to create a dynamic-looking number. BBC Two had pastel-shaded polygons occasionally fading up through a sort of gauzy white void to spell out a number. They needed a change, arguably more than BBC One did. And so the BBC turned to Martin Lambie-Nairn, creator of the Channel 4 blocks, and therefore father of an entire generation of TV branding. Which is nice. For BBC One, he made the traditional globe more abstract and impressionistic, while simultaneously giving the channel an iconic numeral 1 for the very first time, which is a surprisingly hard thing to do. The Lambie-Nairn revamp of BBC Two, however, was nothing short of a revolution. These combinations of live action and computer trickery, that ratio might be different to what you're expecting, succeeded where the old TWO had failed. They were at least as highbrow as a TWO, if not more so, and at least as artsy, but they were also actually interesting to look at. And they had a central icon that was actually powerful and flexible. There's not a lot that can be done with 3 stenciled letters, but the bladed 2, well, it still survives to this day. To help sell the new look at Christmas, BBC One brought out the biggest of Yuletide guns, Mr. K. Kringle himself. Apparently he lives in a giant ice palace in the middle of the frozen north. Accompanied by more sparkles than is frankly seemly, BBC One never really went this far over the top at Christmas again. Instead of trying to integrate the globe, which to be fair to them they only tried twice in the cow era as well, they instead transposed the moon, because that's vaguely Christmassy, complete with Mr. S. Claus doing a flyby whenever there was time and when it wasn't introducing the news. The big marquee movie that year was the network premiere of Tim Burton's Batman, which was such a big event it even got its own ident. Strangely enough, the Globe that year made an appearance on BBC Two, in the trailers at least, as they went with a faintly unsettling A Trip to the Moon motif. The resulting ident made very little sense, but felt Christmassy almost by default, certainly in comparison to the more stately and deliberate idents in the initial Lambie-Nairn package. "1992 was a throwback to 1989's Toys Under the Tree motif, only this time instead of circling around on a train set, the toys had to leap into the house via the chimney, although fortunately they did all survive the jump, and without collecting an inch-thick layer of soot, or killing a nest of birds. It's one of the cuter Christmas idents the BBC ever did, so much so in fact that it was decided not to show it at close down, being replaced by a slightly eerie still photograph of Mrs. Queen. Some Burke or other at the BBC decided it was too jolly to carry off the national anthem. Strangely enough, this one wasn't. As for BBC Two, well, for whatever reason, they didn't really have a unified Christmas look that year, instead alternating between the chimney tops and the donkey, and this slightly creepy pantomime theme, which seems to me like it was going to be the main theme, but for whatever reason fell through. Perhaps all the other trailers were too creepy to use, and they had to quickly knock up that weird donkey thing. Whatever the reason, it did feel at the time like a bit of a damp squib, although the ident itself was fine. Bit bland, but fine. 1993 would more than make up for it, however, because 1993 was one of the best years ever for Christmas presentation.
Christmas Sunday on BBC One.
Animated North Pole, albeit with penguins in it, because geographical accuracy be damned, everyone loves penguins, culminating in a colossal snow-sculpted one that looked good enough to eat. For the first time since 1988, there are even variants for daytime and evening, which is nice. BBC Two's entry, meanwhile, was nothing short of an epic, and as such deserves to be savoured in full. See? Genuinely brilliant, incredibly intricate. Whoever made it deserves a mince pie at the very least, because it must have been an absolute whore to put together. There's something vaguely Teutonic about it, like Brothers Grimm, and I mean proper Brothers Grimm. Neat. When I was a kid, I had a book of the complete works of the Brothers Grimm, unabridged. Everybody knows that unabridged fairy tales, especially the Grimms, are dark, but it's not just because of the gruesome events depicted therein, although those don't help. It's a pervading atmosphere that inspired magic realism in the 20th century. That this is a magical world, but that's not necessarily a good thing. In fact, it's just as grotesque as the real world, but with fewer rules. That's the sense I get from this animation. And at this point I'd just like to break off to justify myself one more time, because all of that babble about magic realism and Germanic folktales might rightly come across as a bit pretentious in talking about a holiday-related channel identity from 20 years ago. And, okay, maybe it is. But look at this thing. People had to put this together. People had to come up with it in the first place. People had to make those models by hand and manipulate them 1/10 of an inch at a time. They had to compose the music and make sure it sounded appropriately medieval and vaguely Christmassy and just a little bit off-centre to suit the BBC Two image. They had to paint all the props and the figures and get the expressions right on those little troll people and make sure it's lit effectively. And god damn it, some of the stuff about Grimm fairy tales and Garcia Marquez I was just going on about didn't occur to them at the time. It occurred to me, and I don't know nothing about nothing. This is art, god damn it. It might not be for any particularly noble purpose, but people had to sweat blood to get this stuff done, in the certain knowledge that no one would ever learn, let alone remember, their names. That makes it art to me. "1994 had a sort of snowman cabaret theme on BBC One, with the trailers forced to operate in a rather confined space. I never tried that again. Once again, the idents had variants, but this time it was actually built into the Christmas season itself. Here's the first showing on Christmas Eve. Here's Christmas Day. Ooh, what a surprise. And here's every other day from Boxing Day until they got bored and gave up and went back to the Globe sometime around December the 28th. Meanwhile, BBC Two just carried on ploughing its own highbrow, artistic and very slightly creepy furrow, as per usual. 1995 saw BBC One go for a deceptively simple Christmas tree motif, with a little toy plane buzzing around it because shut up. This was simultaneously less elaborate than the multiple set snowman cabaret of the previous year, without noticeably scaling down in any way. if you see what I mean. Meanwhile, BBC Two eschewed highbrow imagery and avant-garde representational symbolism for a change in favour of Wallace and Gromit, who it should be illegal not to love. This was the first time a character or personality would be used in an ident, but unfortunately not the last. 1996 was another watershed, the final go-round for the original corporate look, and the last hurrah for the old slitted one. That sounds vaguely obscene. That old logo's final Christmas brought forth a circus theme, because why not? Meanwhile, BBC Two went back to being weird and creepy with this sort of floral Santa wizard person who played optical illusions in the trailers and did some real magic in the ident. The following October it was all change again, as the BBC returned to Martin Lampinan and asked him to relaunch the entire corporation. The result was BBC One's balloon idents. If you must have live-action channel identities, this is how you do it. An actual, recognisable symbol diegetically placed in the middle of the action, as opposed to just things happening with the logo stuck on top of it. We didn't know it then, but this was the last time to date that we'd see the globe in a BBC ident, albeit picked out in yellow and red, so they'd stand out better, and also so it wouldn't clash with the CSO that they'd inevitably have to use for the second wave of idents. BBC Two, meanwhile, managed to get away with it. Their idents were just too good to get rid of, and so the basic concept and most of the idents themselves remain, albeit now in widescreen. All this led to the intriguing question, what would they do at Christmas? Well, much like the balloon idents themselves, it couldn't have been more different to what had come before. Animation was out, live action was in, with these somewhat abstract interpretations of the 12 Days of Christmas. These idents are apparently quite popular, but I never liked them. They were just a bit too oblique, and orange isn't a very Christmassy colour. I mean, I appreciate the effort and the idea, but for me, they just didn't work. Plus they vanished with unseemly haste, with the balloon back into service by December the 27th. I mean, I know that's like the joke of the woman saying the food here is terrible in such small portions, but for me, Christmas idents should stick around until New Year. Go back to the grind on January the 2nd like the rest of us. Otherwise it's just like a miserable uncle who tears down the decorations on Boxing Day and hurls them into a great big bin. I assume everyone has one of those. Meanwhile, on BBC Two, instead of creating something of lasting worth, they decided to just throw the current faces of the channel into the trailer campaign in an apparent attempt to generate some sort of Pavlovian response, culminating in a final ident for which the intention seems to have been to make the viewer seem chastened and ashamed at the very notion of celebrating Christmas. And I like Reeves and Mortimer. This is what Wallace and Gromit hath wrought. "1998 brought forth the balloon reimagined as a colossal dangling bauble. Unfortunately, the trailer package was very much a dying art by this point, reduced to just a handful of stings whenever there was 10 seconds to spare. Over on BBC Two, alright, so putting the logo on a Christmas tree isn't the most original idea in the world, but it's all in the execution, by which I mean the Shrieking Fairy. I have no idea what's going on here. 1999 was of course the turn of the millennium, but for some reason they didn't bother mentioning that at all in the Christmas idents that year, instead going for this sort of holographic Father Christmas thing, which was very lovely indeed. As a bonus, they were still making some kind of vague effort with the trailer packages as well at this point. Oddly enough, 2 years into its service, this is the first time the balloon had actually properly appeared in person in a Christmas ident, and a very lovely ident it was too. In fact, the only problem was it disappeared after Boxing Day. Over on BBC Two, alright, so putting the logo on top of a Christmas tree isn't the most original idea in the world, but it's on forget it. I wouldn't mind, but they even recycled the fairy angle. Finally, because I had to stop somewhere, 2000. Which the BBC gave us an unashamedly over-the-top rendition of an idea that was so obvious in retrospect it's actually kind of a surprise that it took until the fourth go-round to actually do it. The BBC have never really gone this big since with their Christmas idents, nor, I would argue, this magical. And I use the word as an adjective rather than a term of praise. Meanwhile, BBC Two, after a brief return to the Yentob and MacDonald era of highbrow edginess, went with something explicitly silly again. And why on earth not? This one actually made a surprise comeback 6 years later to introduce coverage of the Torino Olympics, which is nice. Why do I keep saying that? Unfortunately, after this point, it all starts to tail off. Television presentation increasingly comes under the responsibility of people who know all about targeting and branding and demographics, and neither know nor care very much about art. And of course, you might ask, why should they? After all, they're making channel identities, not painting the Sistine Chapel. Well, I for one don't think art needs to be rationed. In fact, I think the world in general would benefit if there was a little bit more art in absolutely everything everyone ever did. Neither do I think that art is just for special occasions or special people, that something like television presentation can't be art because it's not good enough for it. I mean, if Martin Creek can get 200 grand for putting a blinker in an empty room, surely this thing deserves to be hung in a gallery somewhere. Even Dunstable. Actually, I don't have a problem with the concept of the lights going on and off. What I have a problem with is that, when interviewed about it, Martin Creek blithely indicated that he neither knew nor cared what it meant. On the other hand, Bernard Newnham and his team absolutely slaved over this minute's worth of stop-motion animation, in the full knowledge that it was about as ephemeral as a work could get, short of being snow sculpture, just to make your Christmas that little bit more magical. Because the BBC could have just chucked a bit of snow on the logo or put a few sprigs of holly around the corner of the screen and just repeated that pattern over and over again every year. But they didn't. They decked out that mirror globe. They created intricate little porcelain tableaux. Even when the budget was stretched to breaking point, they threw something together, even if it did have certain members of the British public baying for these symbols' public execution. These were made by people who loved what they did, who loved creativity, and had the freedom to be creative. And that passion shows through in the best of these. And that, ultimately, what sells. To everyone. Something you can remember, and will remember, and enjoy remembering. That appeals to every demographic. Merry Christmas.
Tone me. Yes, ha ha, they've made me up as a Christmas pudding again. The BBC Globe is round, a Christmas pudding is round, so why not make it into a Christmas pudding? What a bloody hilarious BBC festive Christmas type of joke.
And now on BBC One, some more seasonal goodies from our Christmas stocking.
Not happy, you know.
So why don't we unwrap another cracker and see what's inside?
Why is it snowing on a pudding? When was the last time you saw a Christmas pudding covered in snow? It's stupid, mate.
Everybody conga, shaken by
Oh,
a
no,
racket.
here he is. Hissed again.
Excuse me, officer. Where's BBC Two? I'm on a bit.
You're on the wrong channel, sir. Push off to Channel 4 and join the others.
I can't. I didn't make the grade.
I'm going to bed.
Oh, Mr. Grimsdale, I love you.